Hey, folks, welcome to another enlivening conversation exploring the soul and the health of our nation. And I'm very excited to talk with my friend Kristin Hansen, who is leading. I call her like the quarterback or the CEO of the movement. She refers to herself as like the Lily Tomlin at the switchboard, connecting people. But she, in my judgment, really has it figured out, more so than anybody I know, in terms of all the different moving parts: institutional, cultural, political, legal. Um, so it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Kristin Hansen. Kristin, welcome.
Thank you, Brandon. That's a super generous introduction. It's really, really nice to be with you today.
Awesome. So my first question to you is like, tell me about your journey into this. Like, how did you go from somebody who wasn't in it to somebody who's like now effectively at the switchboard?
That's right. Yeah, I definitely feel like somebody who fell into a movement, right? And maybe many of us can relate to that sensation of having fallen into a movement over the last several years and prompted by similar sentiment, the sense that maybe some of us, myself included, thought we were sort of coasting along uh, decently well as a country. Frank Fukuyama talked about the end of history. It was easy as a student back in the 1990s, like I was, to think things were all trending in a good direction,
Mhm.
domestically, internationally. We were seeing the opening up of the former Soviet Union. We were seeing economic indicators rise and trade open up and globalization happen. It was all so exciting. And when things started to unwind and unravel, and in hindsight, going back to the beginning of the 2000s,
Mhm.
I sort of had blinders on.
Mhm.
I was kind of rolling along in my own life, not seeing some of the corrosion happening in American civic life, not seeing the undercurrents of frustration and discontent. And so by the time 2016 and that election rolled around, uh, I had been bumbling along somewhat blindly for a while, I think, blindly and comfortably in my
Mhm.
life, and not really seeing the indicators of change and the indicators of unrest and the indicators of division occurring around me in American civic life. So when that election happened, count me surprised. Like, I think
Mhm.
millions of people were surprised. What
Same.
I say about that election is some people were really delighted, some people were really horrified. Almost everyone was surprised. In my case, I could have, I suppose, tried to find a place to put that surprise and compartmentalize it and move on. For whatever reason, that's not what happened to
Mhm.
me. I, at that time, was working in the private sector, I was working in tech in, my latest managerial role and really enjoying my career when something deeper started speaking and awakening inside of me. I had never contemplated the possibility of feeling something like a calling in my
Mhm.
career. I'd always kind of discounted that idea that I would feel called to a certain kind of work. I was just trying to, hold it all together. A working mom living in an expensive area and trying to make ends meet. That was about all I could manage. But the call came nonetheless.
Mhm.
And what was the shape of that? So after the 2016 election happened, and I was trying to make sense of all of the currents flowing
Mhm.
around me and all of us in the wake of that election, it took me a while to dig down to what I thought was a deep root cause issue or problem space that I felt drawn to work in. And for me, that problem space was division.
Mhm.
Division itself, the presence of a deep division in our country that was surfaced in some ways, I think, very usefully by that election. But as it came up to the surface, became, in my mind at least, like a really important fact to deal with
Yeah.
for the sake of our nation's civic health. The fact that was confronting me then and continues to confront me to this day is that as we've gone through several successive election cycles now, um, our electorate has been confronted with some pretty stark choices on one or the other side of the ticket, whether it's at the national level and increasingly down ballot too, at the state level, at local
Mhm.
levels, these
Mhm.
kind of stark choices. And as a nation, when we're faced with these stark choices, we keep coming down roughly even on
Mhm.
both sides. That's just a fact. What do we
Yeah.
do with that? I find that question endlessly fascinating. I find that to be a big, gnarly knot that I personally never get tired of trying to unravel and work on, given that we, for whatever combination of reasons, hold vastly different perspectives about what is the correct course for our
Mhm.
nation and how should it be led? How should my state be led? How should my community be led? Given those stark differences, how do we hold together some semblance of a national identity, of a civic fabric, of a
Mhm.
sense that this grand American experiment can and will endure despite this this knife edge balance that we perpetually find ourselves on as a country. So,
Yeah.
for me, that's a lot of the origin story of how I came into the work, and somewhat symbolically, I guess, started along with my partner Rob Romero an organization called Civic Health Project because we felt that that really was a term that captured in the best possible way the essence of what we're hoping to contribute to in some small way, and that is the enduring civic health of
Mhm.
America as one idea, as one grand experiment, as something unprecedented in the history of mankind, and that we have to figure out how to do that despite that crazy and incredibly balanced division that exists in our country. So
Yeah.
that's it. That's me and that Civic Health Project in a nutshell. And we got off the ground not too long after the 2016 election
Mhm.
as part of what I would call the Big Bang. Actually,
Mhm.
I'm borrowing that term from a colleague, Mike Berkowitz at Democracy Funders, the Big Bang of individuals and organizations that have just poured into
Mhm.
civic health,
Yeah.
bridge building, and democracy strengthening work over the last several years. We weren't the first. We definitely weren't the last.
No.
And, I'm inspired by the fact that people and new organizations and teams are still pouring in. The Big Bang continues. And I'd say, hey, we'll take all of that civic energy that we can get because this is on all of us, right?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
And it's I mean, because my story is very similar to yours. Like, I was caught off guard both in 2016 and then 2020 also was, like, a very big kind of deepening for me. Um, but I'm curious if, you would reference that, looking back, you missed some of the signs that there were, like, the faults were forming or the divisions were being shored up. I'm curious, like, um, was that always the case? Because
Yeah.
you read these editorials that say, like, well, actually, we were way more divided in the '60s than we are now. Now
Not
it's
to
just like,
mention the 1860s.
yeah, and the 1860s. Like, there have
Right.
been times where, like, division has, like, reared its head. And so I guess my question to you,
Yeah.
having been in it, now leading it, you know, has it always been this way? Is that like a fundamental thing? Or has some deeper rip, some novel shift happened in our culture that has us be at this moment?
Yeah. I mean, I want to start answering that on a more hopeful note, which is
Yeah.
that when I really put our American history in perspective, as I try to do, I mean, I was a
Mhm.
political science major and I took a lot of history classes and have continued to read a lot of history books since. In many ways, you could say our divisions have been attenuating over the last century and a half, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement. We keep acquiring along the way as a society, learning, insights, skills, and then we put into place structures and mechanisms that help us to litigate, navigate, adjudicate our differences so that
Mhm.
we are not at the present moment locked in combat against
Mhm.
one another. We're not in a civil war. We're not shooting at each other in large numbers. And that's, we must acknowledge that that's an indicator of progress, perhaps,
Mhm.
that we're
Mhm.
finding less violent, more constructive ways to work
Yeah.
through our differences. But the other thing I would say is that history is not necessarily a guide to our future. We cannot be too
Mhm.
complacent. We cannot assume that the pattern will always be in an attenuating direction. And there are, many people raising various degrees of alarm about where we could be heading as a country right now. And I would say we shouldn't discount
Mhm.
those alarm bells as we hear them ringing, whether it's the prospect of civil war, whether it's the prospect of secession movements, whether it's the prospect of political violence breaking out around the upcoming or other political elections. These are all things that we cannot discount all the way to zero, but neither should we become paralyzed or assume that we cannot find constructive paths that are alternatives to those dire scenarios. And I
Mhm.
think that when I consider the work of the bridge builders and the democracy strengtheners in our country writ large, that work is all about identifying and implementing constructive ways forward that help us bypass these more dire scenarios. And the vantage point that I have allows me to feel more hopeful than alarmed, simply because when I look out, either in the direction of bridge building or structural reform work or election strengthening work, I am both incredibly inspired and heartened by how many Americans have decided to make this kind of work a sizable percentage of their time. Whether
Mhm.
they're doing it as their full-time job, their part-time job, or they're volunteering on the side, it's incredibly inspiring to know that you are one of an army of thousands and thousands of democracy strengtheners in the country, right? And then to see the actual work that's happening. It's very thoughtful. Over the last, I don't know how you define the time period, whether it's 4 or 8 or 12 or 16 years, but the the broad movement to renovate and shore up and strengthen our democracy, as well as some of um, the subset efforts within that, such as bridging these stark divisions in our country, have all expanded, have all matured, have all become more connected, and have all become better funded over the last several years, such
Mhm.
that what we have is not just a lot of scattered goodwill energy,
Right.
but really thoughtful, really organized, almost dare I say, a corporate, because I think that's a framing that works for this
Mhm.
audience,
Yeah.
is almost a more corporate approach. If you think about the way markets form, they're freewheeling and chaotic initially, as they are here in Silicon Valley, where I live. But over
Mhm.
time, you know, planets form and and stars form, and you can start to make out the shapes and the broad
Mhm.
strokes of all the different initiatives and make sense of them together. And fortunately, I think very fortunately, that's where we are in many different elements of the
Yeah.
cross-partisan democracy strengthening work today. So on balance, I feel hopeful. And I think we all need to be vigilant and work together to, again, forestall some of those worst case scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah. Right on. Um, I just kind of a side question. You talked about Civil War, and
Mm.
obviously the movie that came out earlier this year.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Have you seen the second Civil War movie?
No, I'm not sure what
So
you're
it was like
referring to.
a B movie from like the 90s.
Wow.
So like in all the ways that the Civil War, that one that came out was like lacking substance, uh, it actually has quite a lot of substance in it, despite it being like a bunch of like a B movie comedy thing with like Phil Hartman and Dennis Leary, and anyways, it's on Amazon Prime. You should check it out because like
Yeah.
you kind of see this like if we weren't paying attention to all the things that you're talking about, all these like flashpoints where we need people, like good people to like lower the temperature,
Yep.
empathize, and move us forward.
Yep.
Um, like this series of dominoes could actually happen pretty quickly. And so, anyways, this whoever wrote this script was either clairvoyant or like a political science major, or like
Wow. Brandon, you're going to have to point me to that. That
I
sounds
will.
like an
I'll
amazing
send it to you. Yeah,
resource.
it's
An
called
amazing resource.
The
Yeah.
Second Civil War. It's very good.
Okay. Wow.
Um,
I'll go check that out. And it brings up the broader point about storytelling and narrative.
mhm.
And uh, you know, storytelling, narrative, futurism, these are emerging as some of their own distinct lanes within democracy strengthening work, because people recognize that how we see ourselves in this American experiment can be driven a lot by the narratives that are put before us. And, a strongly negative narrative like the Civil War movie can be a very powerful and impactful wake-up call. I think it's useful to put those sorts of more apocalyptic scenarios out there. At the same time, we need to be able to see positive, inspiring outcomes for ourselves and our country and our civic fabric that prompt our imagination in more positive directions. And I'm so delighted to see how much work is going on right now around describing the future of our democracy. There's kind of a very short-term and a very long-term horizon to that right now. So first of all, there are a group of organizations looking past this election to America's 250th birthday,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
2026. And so everyone in this audience should be paying attention to what you will start to see as some really positive, inspiring narratives around America's 250th birthday that are cross-partisan, that are connecting, that are reconnecting us to our founding ideals, principles, and values as a nation. And I'm so excited. I can't wait for 2026. As nervous as we all feel about 24, well, let me tell
Yeah,
you, 26 is going to be awesome.
it is
And
going to be awesome.
then, yeah, and then there's a group of even more visionary thinkers and dreamers about democracy that are looking out to 2076. Let's imagine the next 50 years for our democracy, and what could it look like then? Knowing what we know about trends in technology and climate, in governance, how can we harness all of that and start to paint a picture of the really exciting and hopeful and possible futures for our democracy, rather than just the notion that it's inevitably going to unravel before then.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and that's where I spend most of my time too, is like on the storytelling front, and that's
Yeah,
I'll share more about that with you soon. But I would love to get connected to those folks as well, because it seems like we could have a lot of
absolutely.
fun together.
Absolutely. And, just like in many of these reform spaces, they're all finding each other. And as they do, the stories get even bigger and more visionary and more audacious in the positive pictures that they paint for our future. So that's another hopeful note as far as
Mhm.
I'm concerned, is that we live in such an innovative society. We are innovators, we are tinkerers, we are entrepreneurs, and to see all of that energy pouring into democracy and civic health work is, well, what can I say? It's like connecting two halves of my heart into a whole. The kind of the business-like modes and methodologies that can really deliver results with the dreaming and the vision and the values of what it means to engage in this crazy experiment in self-governance.
Yeah, amen. So I'm curious, because I know that your time is very valuable. You got more lines and switchboards to connect.
That's right.
But like having both been in the weeds, but also at these 30,000 foot level conversations, like what do you see as being like a theory of change, like that we could hold on to and be like, yeah, okay, I can find
Yeah.
myself in that place. Like what would success look like in that scenario?
Well, let me take on that question at the level of the work that I primarily focus on, which is how do we collectively as a country bridge our divides, learn to engage constructively across differences? If we were to succeed in that, what would that look like? And let me kind of work back to a theory of change. So earlier you asked, hasn't division always been this way? What's different now? And
Mhm.
an additional thought I wanted to get in response to that question is that um, in some sense, yes, it's always been that way. And now I'm not just going to go back to the Civil War. I'm going to go back to the beginning of human civilization. And as many of us know, and as social psychology and anthropology and evolutionary theory tell us, there is deep internal wiring in humans that makes us tend to seek the safety of groups, to make us
Mhm.
groupish, to make
Yeah.
us tribal, to look for in-group validation, to seek the security of belonging to a group, which then necessitates defining an out-group. to seek the validation and reassurance from a group that we are moral and we are righteous because that makes us feel safe. So all of that's in us, and one could argue it always has been. So what's different now? Well, again, on the positive side of the ledger is that as we've evolved as a human society and as an American society, we have found ways to define our tribes bigger, to define them more flexibly, to navigate across tribes. You know, again, we equip ourselves intergenerationally with more and more skills so that we're not talking about 8 people in a cave. We're talking about a country of 330 million people that more or less functions. It's incredible. You know, that's an incredible result. At the same time, all this wiring we have makes us vulnerable. And I think, you know, part of what's different right now, it's this confluence of factors that are allowing many mechanisms to operate on that wiring powerfully and simultaneously in ways we have not had to confront before as individuals or as a whole society, right?
Right.
And even that's not one thing. So we can point to the impact of successive waves of media, news, cable news, talk radio, social media, all operating on us, all bombarding us with perspectives that are no longer moderated. These are
Right.
unmoderated interactions that are happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Combine that with a society whose incentives and rewards have been trending in the direction of individualism, of exhibitionism, of broadcasting, of speaking rather than listening. You know, what we've come to define as virtuous in our brilliant, innovative society is that we should be advocates, we should be confident, we should be firm in our point of view. And so some of these are like social patterns and trends that take us in the direction of asserting rather than assimilating. And I think this is some of what your work entails too, Brandon, right? Is, you know, to what extent should we be wiring ourselves to be confident asserters of how things should be because society will reward us for that, versus will society reward me if I listen, if I reflect, if I consider different perspectives, if I give some credence to different perspectives? Is there a reward system wrapped around me for that kind of behavior? So when it comes to a theory of change, let me try to kind of put a bow on this. And again, I'm going to use business language. So at Civic Health Project, we talk about these stark divisions in our country as a perverse supply and demand loop. What do I mean by that? Okay, what do I mean by that? How is polarization a bad supply and demand loop? So I talked about that internal wiring in all of us. Think of that as the demand side. We as individuals, we have this tendency to crave things that on one level are good for us and on another level aren't. That in-group feeling, that validation, those dopamine hits from liking or commenting on something on social media, that's the demand side. We are in some sense asking for a society that outlines these divisions, that puts us on one side of those divisions. Can we unwind that? Yeah, potentially we can. I mean, that's where I'll come back to it, but that's where the work of bridge building as a movement really is. It's equipping people with the insights, perspectives, and ultimately the skills to kind of overcome and transcend that internal wiring. But now let me come to the supply side, because the supply side is part of the problem too in this loop, in the sense that there are plenty of entities in our society that benefit when we are divided. That's the supply side. Who is that? What is that? Well, that could be our political systems and our political actors. It could be media and social media actors and decision makers. It could be influencers with an outsized role or voice. These are parties and entities that benefit when we're more divided from one another because outrage sells. What does it sell? You might be able to garner donations, votes, tweets, likes, shares, the approval of people who matter to you. These are all different ways in which creating stark division among the many entails rewards for the few. And so that's the supply side. So when we talk about a theory of change in the bridging field, one of the highest ways that I can abstract that is that there are a multitude of organizations and interventions across the country that are really working on this problem of how emotionally divided we have become from one another. Very
Mhm.
low levels of trust, high levels of suspicion, very low levels of social cohesion, high levels of dissension. How do we unwind that? It really does take a multitude of actors and approaches, some working on, let me get my hands right, some working on the demand side, the
Mhm.
wiring that's in us, some working on the supply side, going directly after the incentives and behaviors of those who are trying to make us feel outraged at each other and more divided from each other. And then when you break it down further, I mean, really, there are so many different approaches that can be
Mhm.
constructive, but I think it's just a matter of breaking that loop
Mhm.
so that on the demand side as humans, we are preferring, we are demanding experiences that are less divisive and more cohesive. And on the supply side, the incentives change so that whether it's politicians or media or corporations or
Mhm.
other
Mhm.
societal leaders, the incentives align such that they see their role as shoring up
Mhm.
social cohesion and not tearing it down, shoring up institutions and not tearing them down.
Right.
None of this is easy. And I never know, like, is it easier on the demand side or the supply side? And the answer is neither.
Neither, yeah. And, but on the supply side, I mean, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, like policies, things that we could put in place that would just create
Yeah.
the incentive structures differently.
Yeah.
And we've had, essentially, let's call it like 3 or 4 decades of, like, laissez-faire, culture development on the demand side. Like, def we're not doing civic education. We're not doing with rites of passage where people have like the self-awareness,
Right.
the sovereignty to know themselves, choose what's right for them, what's right for their community. So I'm curious, have you seen any bright spots on the demand side? Because like I said,
Mhm.
the supply side feels like put any adult in the room, they would say like, yeah, don't do that, do this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I'll touch on the supply side
Mhm,
quickly and then shift over.
mhm,
The thing I like to always remind myself and others is that both sides of that equation are comprised of people. It's people, and people are not fixed entities. Nobody is. In my opinion, everyone can grow, everyone can change, everyone can adapt. And so that's why I think it's important not to write off any person, any institution as being incapable of contributing constructively to our American civic life. So
mhm,
I love the fact that there are many teams and organizations that are working with social media platforms, working with legislatures at the local, state, and federal level, working with governing bodies and
mhm.
institutions and trade associations, and you name it. Like,
Right.
that is all excellent, excellent work. And you see the shifts happening because at the end of the day, these are people. And frankly, everyone's being worn down by the division. Even if you're caught up on the supply side of it, you might just be tired of it, right? And that gives the work some tailwinds. Now,
Right.
on the demand side, um, yeah, what gives me an incredible amount of hope is when we're talking about rewiring ourselves or transcending that wiring that's in us to
Mhm,
tend to think in rigid us versus them terms, us or the other, right versus wrong, all these binaries that we get caught up
mhm,
in. Um, you know, the effort to address and ameliorate these deep divisions in the country has kind of exploded, as I described earlier, as a grassroots movement. You've been a part of it. I've been a part of it. And it's incredibly powerful and foundational to kind of shift we need to make in our country.
mhm,
But what really gives me hope is how that grassroots energy is now kind of moving up and out into our broader civic institutions. This isn't
mhm,
just about grassroots energy meeting individuals on some heartfelt level, although that is a big
mhm,
part of the work, but
mhm,
it is also how do we how do we bring pro-social norms that will help uh, us remain more cohesive and connected as a society, to strengthen our civic fabric, to shore up our institutions? How do we bring those sensibilities approaches, experiences, practice opportunities into the places where Americans show up, the
Mhm.
places where we naturally gather, where we work, where we study, where we pray, where we play, where we serve, where we lead. Bridging isn't something that people go to and find separate
Mhm.
from their lives. Some will, but
Right.
most won't. But if we weave these bridging norms and sensibilities into the day-to-day lives of Americans, if we meet them in the places where they choose to be or have to be,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, that is going to be far more sustainable, sticky, and ultimately scalable across American civic life. And this is what I see happening. It's incredible, from churches to libraries to workplaces to legislatures to school boards to homeowners associations. The work is underway. The work is
Mhm.
underway. People are kind of rejecting that perverse supply and demand loop and saying, no, I want to unwind this. I want to learn how. I want to understand what's going on. I want to learn how to unwind it, and I want to practice unwinding it with my family, with my community, with my townspeople, and kind of ladder up from there. So yeah,
Mhm.
I feel really hopeful.
Good. I mean, I'm hopeful as well. One question that um, that comes up for me is this kind of ongoing exploration. So my mom and her fiance live up in Mariposa, which is a small town near
Oh, sure,
Yosemite.
outside Yosemite.
Um, and it's like 60-40 conservative to liberal. And like I was just up there last weekend and at the fair and just kind of noticing like, what's the temperature? How are people acting? And I saw literally like two things that I would regard as like being divisive,
Yeah.
and I guess I'm curious, is there something about scale? Like, given that the tiny community that is so economically, politically, culturally, in some cases spiritually, like interdependent and woven together, like coaching each other's little league teams and tutoring each other, and like, is there something about scale that we're missing in this movement? Because like, are we too big at the national level that we should be thinking about, like, well, maybe there's a Dunbar number, maybe there's some other kind of number in terms of
Yeah.
how we do America.
Yeah. Well, and some people think that ought to be the state level, right? I mean, the
Mhm.
state level is kind of a really curious and interesting level for thinking about division and connection.
Mhm.
When you compare it to the federal level, can a state, any of the 50 states, be more cohesive than we can at a national level? And then when you break it down further within any given state, are communities really the right locus for shoring up and strengthening our civic fabric? I hate to say it, but I think the answer has got to be all of the above, because there is really powerful and transferable um, community building and bridge building work going on in local communities all over the country.
Mhm.
Many of the bridging organizations that comprise this grassroots movement are centered on and focused on specific individual communities. Um, and and some of that work is extremely deep and extremely long term. The challenge is that, well, twofold. First of all, in a country of 330 million, that's a lot of little towns to try to equip and empower with these
Yeah.
insights and skills. And second, all of our little communities, mine, yours, all of them, are
Mhm.
getting rained down on by the national
Right.
tenor of our politics. And it's
Mhm.
unrelenting. It's like a constant downpour that can wash away the strengthening efforts of local communities. And I
Right.
happen to know, because I've spent time up there, Mariposa is not immune from this. Mariposa is an adorable town, a very politically mixed town that has
Mhm.
become and will likely continue to be a flashpoint from time to time when it's convenient for the conflict profiteers to tell a divisive story about Mariposa, or a
Mhm.
divisive story about the town I live in, or the divisive story about the next
Mhm.
town
Mhm.
over. And
Yeah.
um, it doesn't take much to unravel a lot
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
stitches in that social fabric. So every local community has to be vigilant and resilient. And for those of us in the movement, thinking about, again, that transportability of ideas and approaches is where I think some of the national infrastructure can play a really important role. So if you're on the ground working with one church community and you have incredible insights about how to hold a congregation together, lifting that up and passing it across and using
Hmm.
mechanisms that allow other church communities to benefit from
Do
that
the
wisdom.
same. Yeah.
Yeah, really, really is important.
Yeah.
So it's the local to national, national to local dynamic that is going to allow us to be very place-based with this civic strengthening work, but at the same time, learn quickly and enable as many communities as possible to DIY this.
Amen.
Yeah.
That's my hope as well, that there's that
Yep.
transference. So before we go,
Yeah.
I was curious if you could share a moment, maybe the moment where you like really felt most American, most like you belong, that this was like your place, your place to protect and strengthen.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for preparing me with that question because I definitely needed to take a beat and think about it. And, you know, first thing I'll say is that it really was the 2016 election and its aftermath and the emotional reaction I had to that election and to the divisions in our country that made me
Hmm.
feel so American. It primed my American identity in a way that I had not previously appreciated was there before.
Yeah.
And that American identity has been foregrounded ever since. You know,
Hmm.
I did not think that I was a person who was going to enlist myself to, safeguard this notion of a unified country, a unified sense of America. Where did that come from? I don't even know, but it was in me.
Hmm.
Um, but I will also share, aside from that, aside from the fact that I'm, you know, a silver lining for me and maybe for many of my colleagues in this work out of the last several years has been experiencing a deep and profound awareness and gratitude and sense of obligation toward that American identity.
Yeah.
I'm eternally grateful for that. So the moment that leapt into my mind in response to your question was actually a couple years after the election. It was 2018 summer, and for the very first time in my life, I traveled to the ancestral family farm that my great great grandfather had left in the 1850s uh, in Norway to travel to the United States and never to return,
Hmm.
right? It just wasn't feasible in the day. And I stood on a patch of grass. The farm is still in my family, unbelievably. Um, but I was the first person in that line of
Hmm.
family to return
Yeah.
to the farm. And that was really profound. It connected me to my American story in a way that I had not been connected to it before. And in doing so, it kind of connected me to the story of most
Hmm.
Americans who at some generational point in their ancestral line came from somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that decision of our forebears to create their destiny and ultimately our destiny here, it's so profound, it's so consequential. And they carried hopes and aspirations with them. And I think that's an obligation. I think that's an obligation. I felt it standing there in Norway, to appreciate the
Yeah.
scary, incredibly scary decision they made to seek out something better for themselves and then contribute to what ultimately became a pretty amazing, experiment in self-governance. And what do I owe them? You know?
Yeah. I know.
So that
It's
was a big moment for me.
very humbling, very humbling.
Mhm.
And also, puts us at choice because we created this when we started. We recreated it in the 1860s. We're still recreating it.
And I'll
And
tell you, going back to Norway is not an option. They have very, very strict immigration requirements. So I think I'm going to have to figure it out. I think we're going to have to figure it out here.
we are. Amen. Um, well, Kristen, thank you so much for your time. I know it's in short supply. Thank you for all the work you do. And I will, in the show notes, include links to all of your work and projects. And just want to again say thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for everything you're doing, Brandon, and for making time to have this conversation with me. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.